A very warm welcome to Royal Botanic Gardens Victoria. Hello, my name is Chris Russell. I am the convener of BGANZ Victoria, and it's fantastic to have so many people gathered here today with a really exciting program. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. We've got 130 registrations today. That is the full capacity. So we really are jammed into the main house here. I hope you're going to be comfortable for the day. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get into the program. There are toilets just out on the right. During the breaks though, there's also further toilets across the road at the visitor centre in the garden. So there will be enough time for you to get across there if required. We've got over 40 gardens represented from Victoria, Tasmania, South Australia, ACT and New South Wales. It is the first time we've had to close the books on one of our annual network meetings, so we're excited about that, but disappointed for those who didn't get a ticket. So we are videoing today's proceedings, and that will be uploaded onto the BGANZ website. So really excited that can be shared more broadly. Sometimes we have a bit of a competition about who's travelled furthest, so which is interesting in a themed climate change day. So it's not a competition about who's got the biggest carbon footprint for today, but I know there's many from interstate, but from within Victoria, I know there's Camperdown always gives it a good run. We've got Mildura, Hamilton, who else? Horsham. What time did you leave today? Or did you come down today? Yesterday afternoon, very well. Shepparton? Albury. Fantastic. Cranbourne?
That's mine.
Fantastic. So we have gathered what we hope is a really exciting program today with speakers from both within Victoria and also interstate, and really just a little bit about the topic climate conservation, collections and community. So the BGANZ Vic Organising Committee, we were aiming to develop a broad theme that really brings together a number of interconnected focus areas of managing botanic gardens, how we manage our plants, our landscapes, our programs and our constituent communities. And when you think about it, the theme really does encapsulate a lot about what botanic gardens are all about. So holding curated collections of plants, collections which increasingly have a focus on plant conservation and biodiversity conservation, collections and landscapes that are increasingly at risk of the impacts of a changing climate, and that critically, without the support of an ownership and involvement of our communities, really we are destined to be fighting an uphill battle for relevance, for political support, and being able to have a positive impact on the future of the planet. So clearly the themes resonated with the great response with you being here today. I would like to acknowledge the support of our sponsors for the event today. So the ongoing sponsorship of BGANZ from Seasol and Augusta Golf Cars, and also particularly for today the Helen McPherson Smith Trust for subsidising the event and making it so accessible for us all. When the organising committee considered who we would ask to speak to the topic in an integrated way, the name Dave Kendal was really an obvious choice. Dr. Dave Kendal is a senior lecturer in environmental management within the School of Technology, Environments and Design at the University of Tasmania. Dave is a researcher and teaches about the reciprocal effects of people on nature in cities and beyond, particularly in horticultural and conservation contexts. Dave started his working life as a global software engineer, but soon settled down to a career in horticulture, as many of us do come from other professions and fall in love with plants. Working as a landscape planner for local government, he completed his PhD in 2012 at the Burnley campus of the University of Melbourne, and then worked as an ecologist with the Australian Research Centre for Urban Ecology. In 2016, he was appointed as a research fellow in urban greening at the School of Ecosystem and Forest Science at the University of Melbourne, funded through the Clean Air and Urban Landscape Hub of the National Environment Science Program. He was a member of the Australia's Threatened Species Scientific Committee from 2015 to 2019, and in 2018 started his current position at the University of Tasmania. So Dave brings a wealth of knowledge and multidisciplinary experience to our gathering today, and really delighted to welcome Dave to provide a keynote speaker and set up the rest of the program. I'll hand over to Dave. Welcome, Dave.
Thanks, Chris. So yeah, thanks. It's really good to be here, and I think as some of you know, ARCU is part of the Botanic Gardens, so I was officially employed by the Botanic Gardens here for a few years. And it's great to be in Tassie too. So if anyone is from Tassie, I'm still getting to know people, and that's all right. Thank you. So I'm still getting to meet people and know people down there too. So I feel like I'm almost Tasmanian. Give me a few more years. But it's good to be back in Melbourne. I've spent a lot of time here and worked with lots of people in the room. So as my CV demonstrates, I've kind of got this sort of eclectic mix of things that I do, but I feel like this topic today is a good fit. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some climate and plant work that we've done, and so with Botanic Gardens. And so some of you all have seen that before, but there's some new stuff that I've been doing with the people here at the Botanic Gardens too about community. So, is it working? The light's coming on, so the batteries are there, I think.
Do you want to sing for some reason? No.
I think I can keep
I'm not a
talking.
tech guy, everyone, so it's going to pull this out like that.
So I should say I've actually resigned from the Threatened Species Scientific Committee. I was on that for 3 or 4 years, and which was a really interesting. I'd really love to be on it in some ways. It's a lot of work and a big job, and my role there was really trying to foster community engagement and so I guess the public consultation processes in association with that. So I think the future in that space is really interesting, and Botanic Gardens have a really interesting role to play. The legislation, with the government federal government being re-elected, it's unlikely there'll be really big changes to that legislation, but it'll be a good conversation for us to be part of. Try again.
Looks like we're going manual.
All right, thanks, Pete. So, so for those of you, I have worked in horticulture. I worked as a landscape planner, I worked as a landscaper, and I guess this plant thing has always been really a big part of my life. And so it's good to be able to have a continuing relationship with Botanic Gardens and with horticulture more generally. So I guess the 2 parts of the research I do is trying to work with land managers to develop data that they can use to inform decision making. So that's one of the important things which I'll talk about a little bit. And the other part is using more psychology. So I'm sure we all know horticulture is half ecology of plants and half biology, but the other half is the psychology of people who are in the spaces that we work in. So I feel like I'm trying to bring all of those things together so we can have a bigger, a more holistic understanding of the way that plants in cities and beyond work. So, and I've always worked really closely with, I write academic papers, which I know not too many people read, but I'm always working with land managers, trying to do both, research that has impact in the world as well as in the academic world. Okay, so I'm trying to turn our topic into this question, which I'm going to have to turn around and read. So how can botanic gardens continue to play a leading role in conservation and connecting the community to nature through their living collections in a changing climate? So I feel like we're all kind of interested in this question, and there's little bits of work that I've done and that can help answer that. So go to the next slide. And the next one. So I'm going to start talking about the climate and collection work that we've done. So I guess we've been talking to the Botanic Gardens here, so Peter Symes in particular, trying to understand a little bit about how climate's going to play out with our living collection. So everybody in Melbourne a few years ago, we were all talking about drought and how these extreme weather events that were going to affect the climate. So I did some work with the City of Melbourne, and then that flowed onto this work with the Botanic Gardens, and that was really how is drought and these extreme weather conditions we're going to affect the plants. We thought that some plants would be vulnerable, so can we try to identify which of those plants are vulnerable in this changing climate? So we know that the collections are important for a whole range of reasons, amenity and conservation, and we know that the climate is changing, and that change is likely to affect the plants and species. And I guess the flip side of that is, as well as trying to talk about vulnerability and risk, is trying to understand what the opportunities are. So the Botanic Gardens have got thousands of species, but there's tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of species in the world that potentially could be added to collections. Okay. So we all know that temperatures are increasing. So you look at these graphs. So any long-term weather station in a city is going to look something like this. So we don't kind of talk about the magnitude of change that's already occurred. Most of the talk about climate change has actually been, I guess, trying to fight the climate change denialists, the question marks about science. So there's a lot of work done trying to remove artefacts like urban heat from the stories that are being told in the papers. So we talk about climate change having maybe 0.5 degree or a bit more of temperature increase that it's caused, which is true. But in cities, the sort of lived experience of people and plants is actually much greater than that. So this is the old weather station that's shut down now on the corner of Latrobe Street in the CBD. So they moved that because the temperature recordings were so high. So they moved it to Olympic Park now. So, but obviously for the trees around there and the people around there, they're living this experience that temperatures are 2 or 3 degrees perhaps higher than they were in the early 20th century. So obviously that's partly climate change, urban heat. There's a whole lot of stuff going on that's leading to this change. So when we think about projections into the future, there's obviously increasing urbanisation. For me, coming back to Melbourne, it's amazing what a big, high density, high rise city it's becoming. So again, this is a pattern that's happening in cities all around the world. So this combination of increasing urbanisation and further climate change is likely to lead to overall increases of 5 or 6 degrees easily. And we're actually on trajectories that are much greater than that into the future. So I guess we started thinking about these extreme climates, but what we came back to was looking at the distribution of plants. These extreme drought and potential evapotranspiration and maximum temperatures, all of these things actually were really bad predictors of where plants grow. But something that was a really good predictor was mean annual temperature. So there's a lot of work done in the States, the plant hardiness zones that are focused on extreme minimum temperatures because extreme minimum temperatures kill plants. And obviously drought and extreme high temperatures kill plants too. But it's really difficult to generalise and predict what the outcomes are going to be across a whole, across many thousands of species of plants. But it turns out that mean annual temperature is a good predictor, and this is something that we know is changing, so we can actually model what the changes in mean annual temperature are going to be. So those 5 or 6 degrees actually is quite significant for plants. So even though it's not the mechanism of why plants die, plants are being killed by drought and other things, it's actually a useful kind of indicator, I think, of a whole range of things. So the relationship between water and temperature is important. Pests and disease, the relationship with temperature is important. So there's a whole range of things that feed into that actually being more useful. It might not be the mechanism, a 2 degree increase in mean annual temperature is not going to kill a plant, but the mechanism across many thousands of species actually is a useful predictor of how likely plants are going to succeed into the future. And the other interesting thing is that we can control irrigation, but we can't control temperature. So that 2 degree increase in mean annual temperature is not something we can do anything about. So, I mean, we all know that plants, distribution is related to climate, and that's a complex thing. Different plants have got different kinds of, physiological responses to environmental variables that mean they occur on, particular slopes, particular soils. It's obviously a really complicated world. But every species pretty much has some kind of graph like this, which shows the frequency of distribution related to mean annual temperature. So this is Eucalyptus leucoxylon, one of those really common trees that we think of across, from here all the way up to Port Augusta is quite a common species. It's widely distributed and pretty sort of bulletproof from an environmental point of view. So Melbourne, even though it's at the southeast of its distribution, was historically right in the middle of its temperature distribution. So Melbourne's historic temperature was 14.5 degrees, and you can see that's pretty much where the peaks of its frequency of occurrence occurred. So Port Augusta must be about 16.5 degrees. I should actually look up exactly what that figure is, but the distribution is, goes up to about 16.5, 17 degrees. So if we go to the next slide. So what we're thinking is, how are plants going to perform at the edges of these ranges? So does that mean something? Does it grow just as well anywhere in its range? From a horticultural point of view, I guess, if we're moving individual plants around. So looking at the abundance of trees in cities in relation to where they occur in that natural distribution, we see that the abundance declines near both the bottom and the top edge. So when we're close to the coldest place where plants are known to occur, and where they're close to the hottest places where plants are known to occur, you see a decline in abundance. So again, this doesn't mean that things are going to drop dead, but it does mean that it's, people are choosing to plant these plants in less near the edges of those limits, which is probably due to performance. So again, interactions with pests and diseases, or less likelihood of survival. Okay. So if we start trying to map these things out, this is the centre of Melbourne, where there's obviously the urban heat effect is greatest. So Melbourne's probably about 16.5, maybe 17 degrees now. If we go to the next couple of slides, just cycle through. So with this is our emissions limited scenario. So this assumes that 10 years ago we got our act together and stopped emitting carbon dioxide in the ways that we agreed at that time. The extreme climate scenario is actually the business as usual one. We're actually tracking worse than the business as usual scenario now. So we're, according to these projections, we're well on track for Melbourne to be 19.5 degrees, or so maybe in 40 or 50 years' time. So that's a really big change from 14.5 degrees. And you can see that we're well beyond that sort of known distribution for eucalyptus leucoxylon. So what we've done is we've combined lots of different sources of information. The world's sort of amazing these days. There's online databases. GBIF, if you've seen, that's got millions of species, so plants and animals, distribution records from all over the globe. Obviously, the work that you do here, the herbarium, would be feeding into that. I've been collecting street tree inventories and gardens and institutional gardens as well, botanic garden records for cities around the world. So I'm up to about 250, but most of this work is done with about 190 cities. And with this, I guess, focus on mean annual temperature, there's good historic data, so modelled historic climate data in BioClim, which also has these future climate projections as well. So it mostly excludes urban heat. That's something we need to consider separately, but it's still a great data source that we can use for lots of information. Okay. So again, we're not going to talk too much about the details. I know a few of us are talking about the kind of work and how it's being applied. If you've got questions, really happy to answer more of the details. But quite simply, what we're doing is looking at the distribution of plants through GBIF, which has got mostly natural records, but some urban records as well. And these urban plant inventories we've been collecting. So we've got a black and a blue line showing distribution. Again, we always have that peak in the middle of the temperature range. The x-axis here is mean annual temperature. And we're basically choosing percentiles where we think, and there's some evidence to show that abundance changes. So between the 20th and 80th percentile in the middle, we think abundance is quite high, and so we give that a green flag, again, to communicate sort of simply with land managers. Whereas where we get to the very extreme, so it might be the 97.5th percentile or the 99th percentile of its range, we give it a red flag, which is saying this plant isn't known to grow anywhere warmer than that particular temperature. So then we can, if we go to the next slide, we can combine all of these things together. We've done assessments of the living collection here, so not every species, but most of them. So nearly 5,000 species in the living collection, 1,000 species of trees. We've done the same thing for plants of conservation significance, which maybe we could add to the collection. So all IUCN red listed plants and EPBC and state listed plants in Australia. So there's about another 20,000 species there. There's been, I won't say too much, but we've talked a lot about what to do with these not well-known plants where we've only got a few records. So in practice, we kind of change the numbers a little bit, assuming that plants can grow in a reasonably broad range. So plus or minus 5 degrees, I think, is a reasonable estimate based on the data of where plants can grow. So there's lots of reasons why they don't. Narrow range, rare species often don't occur naturally in those ranges, but might be able to grow outside of the natural temperature ranges. So looking at the gardens, I mean, it's a bit different. So for different things that we've done, for street trees, the numbers are a bit worse, particularly in a place like Melbourne. But in our living collection here, we can see, we've got in the emissions limited scenario, maybe 15 to 20% of the plants actually will be growing in a climate that those plants have never been recorded growing in before. And with that business as usual scenario, those numbers go up to 20 to 25%. So that's worth thinking about, I guess, for our gardens, and I'm totally confident that those numbers would play out in most gardens, not all of them, depends a bit on the type of collection you've got and the history as much as the actual plants, but those numbers are going to play out in most gardens in the world. So trying to look at this spatially, we can map the trees in this case. So we've got colour-coded trees. So the ones that are red are the ones that we think are at risk, or at least not known to grow in warmer climates. So there's a few that are already, Melbourne's probably the warmest place in the world where some of those species grow. Next one. With that, the emissions limited scenario, you can see that there's more trees, scattered through the landscape. And the next one, you can see that in that business as usual scenario by 2070, there's quite a few of those trees. Some of these are really important trees in the landscape. I'm not saying they're going to die, so established trees in the landscape might respond differently. But in terms of risk management, it's actually really important to start thinking about that. How can we distribute risk across the landscape? There are some places, and I'll have a good story about the New Zealand collection, but the New Zealand collection down the bottom, there's reasons for that, but that's an area where that risk is aggregated in the landscape. Okay. So there's obviously things we can do. We can improve the maintenance of some of these trees. Trees will survive if we increase irrigation. As you all know, there's lots of things that we can do to protect individual trees. But the long-term strategy can't be to do that for all the trees in the landscape. So we need to start thinking about ways of adapting in terms of provenance and the kinds. I guess cultivars is something I'd be interested in thinking more about, subspecies and cultivars. And perhaps more importantly, we've got to this point where we really need to start responding to this change, I think. So we need to work out which species we need to perhaps do some risk assessment of and reduce the frequency of planting, or at least put risk, distribute the risk across the landscape. Maybe try some new stuff. Think about this and work out ways we can manage this risk in the landscape. Okay. So again, others are going to talk a lot more about that. I'm really interested to hear how people are going to respond. But the reality is there's thousands, especially in a city like Melbourne, these temperate cities, most of us will be from temperate gardens. We've got, most species in the world will grow in temperate regions. So this is a different story for Darwin, I've done some little bit of work with their street trees. I'm actually got a contract now with Riyadh, which is going to be a really interesting exercise. So it's already a really hot place, and their climate change projections and urban heat projections are terrifying in cities like that. So I think the story in our temperate cities is different and not necessarily all negative. There's a lot of opportunities in this too. Okay. So looking at the IUCN and EPBC listed species, again, it's this really interesting story. So even though when we're applying really big changes in temperature, 5 or 6 degrees, there's heaps of IUCN red listed species that are known to occur at temperatures with Melbourne being 19 or 20 degrees. So the bars don't change that much. There's 1,400 species or so that are sort of where Melbourne's in the middle of its temperature range now. There's a different suite of species when Melbourne's 19.5 degrees. So maybe there's a 40, 30 or 40% churn in those numbers. So there might be 50 or 60% of those species are the same, but then there's this different suite. So if we're looking at botanic gardens collectively, there's this, again, I think a great opportunity for us to think about conservation of these species across the landscape. This is a really interesting and good conversation to have. So you can see that a bit in some of the state endemic, or the state, these are mostly state endemic species. So the DSE listed species, or DELC listed species these days in Victoria, actually there's a big decline in the number of species where Melbourne, the centre of Melbourne, is going to be in the middle of that temperature range. But for Queensland, there's a big increase. So there'll be a role, I think, in thinking about this collectively. And I'll, again, leave others to talk about this, but we've just done some work with the Climate Change Alliance, which is being led by the Botanic Gardens here, where we've come up with a way where people can, from gardens from different temperatures, can look to see how those species occur in relation to the temperature of those gardens. So for 20-odd thousand species, we can look, are these plants growing? Is there known distribution in the middle or at the same temperature of the gardens? If you think about climate change projections into the future, which ones maybe cover both, or which ones will become more suited to future climate conditions? So again, Peter and others might talk about this a bit more during the day. All right, so we've learned a few things about this. So this is obviously, we're using lots of species and lots of data. And so for individual species, some of this is totally wrong. So we know that some of the red flag species actually grow really well in the gardens here, and probably grow in other gardens that are warmer than Melbourne as well. So we're doing some work trying to think about why that might be the case. So we think overall the numbers are pretty good. And across these, thousands of species, we're thinking it's telling a reasonably good story. So trying to think a bit more about some of the exceptions. Poorly known species is difficult. So when we don't have much data, the projections based on the data obviously aren't necessarily that good. So we're thinking that some narrow range species, again, it's difficult. So there are plants that are historically rare, or grow in really limited environments, so they might be well known, but their natural distribution is not broad. So it's unclear to know how those plants are going to grow outside their known temperature ranges. And interesting things like islands or mountaintops we talked about a little bit last night. So these things are geographically limited, or limited by dispersal, so they're quite likely to grow well outside of those restricted temperature ranges, but we often don't know. So I think a lot of knowledge sharing and experimentation will help try to understand that better. So that's the positive story for New Zealand. I think a lot of those species are probably geographically limited. And the last thing is, I think that there's some species that are really widespread, and things that we often grow in cooler places, but where species are really widespread, I think that there's going to be physiological adaptations that mean we can't predict quite so well where those species are going to grow into the future. All right, so the last sort of half of what I want to talk about is some more recent work. So some of you will have seen most of that before, and I apologise if I was a bit worried that was going to be a bit boring, because I keep talking about that. I've done that talk quite a lot. But this second part is going back to these ideas of the way people interact with plants. So we're doing some work with the Botanic Gardens here that's funded through the Biodiversity 2037 strategy that the Victorian state government's introduced. So this is to me, a really interesting strategy. So I don't know if you remember, there was a white paper and a green paper, going back 10 years or so ago now, that talked about connecting landscapes in Victoria. So there were maps drawn and try to work out where we need to do private land conservation and potentially, public land purchases for reserve systems that's going to allow species to move through the landscape in response to climate change. And after a couple of changes of government, the strategy that was actually adopted had two goals. So one was Victorians valuing nature, and the other one being, having a healthier environment. So this is a really, rather than being a ecological, technocratic strategy, which is not saying there's anything particularly wrong with that. This one is extremely focused on the community. And this kind of change in policy settings happening all around the world. So if we go to the next, so the same thing's happening in Europe. There was Australia's strategy for nature, a draft strategy for nature released 1.5 years or 2 years ago, that was pretty heavily criticised, but it had this kind of same model presented in it. So basically it's arguing that if we connect people to nature, people will look after it, therefore biodiversity will get better. This really kind of interesting thing saying that maybe it's not the people's fault, but it's the people's job to do something about conserving biodiversity. So if we go to the next slide, I've tried to kind of unpack that a little bit. So there's a lot of academic literature that this is based on. There's this phrase, extinction of experience, that's around in the literature a little bit. So it's arguing that people have moved to cities and we've lost contact with nature. We no longer have experience of biodiversity. So because we've lost that contact and knowledge, we don't care about it anymore. So we don't care that biodiversity is in decline or biodiversity is being destroyed. So if we go to the next slide, what we need to do is this, get people to value nature or reconnect with nature. So once people start caring about nature, they will act for nature and lead to the protection of biodiversity. So that all sounds absolutely awesome, of course. So we all kind of agree with that, and I think lots of us are living that out. But in practice, there's a heap of assumptions in this. If we go to the next slide, so we've been doing some work with the Botanic Gardens, and this is all pretty new. We haven't sort of written it all up and published it yet, but we've been running some focus groups where we deliberately chose groups of people, so 3 particular audiences. There was older Australians, parents with younger children, and youth, and we deliberately excluded people who were friends of the Botanic Gardens or super keen gardeners. We're trying to, because it's easy to talk to those people, and most of us, they're all the people that we talk to. So we're trying hard to talk to everyday Australian. So coming back to this idea, we've been talking to people, and now we've got data and other things. So can we try to unpack this hypothesis, I guess, that's in Australia's strategy for nature? So we go to the next slide. So obviously part of this is about people living in cities, and clearly there are more people living in cities. So I would say in Australia it has always been a really urban place. So I think it might have gone from 85 to 87% urban, but generally in the world this is true. And are they becoming disconnected from nature because of that? And I think clearly not. I think that when we use these general terms, connection to nature, people are more connected to nature now and have more possibility of being connected to nature in more different ways than we have in, I guess within our lifespan at least. So, the evidence kind of suggests that people's relationship with urban nature has been changing. So we might have had more veggie gardens, 60 years ago, or that's becoming popular again now. But there was a much more utilitarian understanding, I think, of urban nature, and now we've got this sort of multifunctional, it's providing ecosystem services and aesthetics and heritage, and it's sort of doing all this stuff that it didn't necessarily do in the past. So, but it's clear that people don't really have a sort of, like a few people talked about Extinction Rebellion and some of the sort of popular stuff, or social media influencers they follow, or Leonardo DiCaprio, I think, which I haven't checked, but apparently he's been tweeting about extinction, and so there's little bits of knowledge, but people don't really have any understanding of what's going on at all. So I think that there is this disconnection from biodiversity, but biodiversity is a complex and problematic term, I think too. So this, I think that this idea needs some more unpacking. So one of the ideas we're thinking about, so we've had a few chats with a couple of people at the gardens here, is what can we do? So people actually, this extinction of experience kind of metaphor, I guess, doesn't really make sense to people. So do we need to start revealing some of the things that are happening in our landscape? So we're talking about landscape succession and reducing risk in the landscape. Maybe we should be leaving a bit of risk in a few places too. I mean, I know that trees, the thing with the elm tree in Royal Parade recently was terrible, and so we've got to be really careful about the way we do that. But we're, that in some ways those things are an outcome of these natural processes, and we've become so good at managing landscapes and making great landscapes that we're hiding some of the issues that are happening. So I'm not sure where to go, but I'd love to talk more about that. And so this sort of, the flip side of that, these assumptions about extinction of experience is about reconnecting people with nature. So we think about that a bit more. This is a really complex, so speaking to people are really different. We can't just say we've got to reconnect people with nature. What kind of people are we talking about? Who's included in this and who isn't? What kind of connection are we talking about too? So there's a lot of talk about physical activity and mental health. There's a whole lot of different things that people do. I'm working with some people in Tassie on microbiome, so we're really keen to understand about how people get their hands dirty and how that might lead to changes in their immune system. Knowledge is a really important part of this too. It doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's out riding bikes and going for a jog. It might be just a better understanding through learning about things as well. Obviously what kind of nature, this is just critical to this whole equation. So we can have beautiful landscapes, we can have great urban landscapes, but what does this mean for biodiversity? Are we talking about rare or threatened species? Most people's experience of nature is not that sort of thing about biodiversity loss. It's about the common species, it's about, urban trees are, I think, a really important part of people's experiences. So how do we, if we're interested in telling a story about biodiversity loss, how do we do that? And in ways that make sense, in ways that are positive. So I think that's pretty much all I wanted to say. Is there any more? No? So I'm just sort of happy to talk about all this and a bit of time for questions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Dave. Some really thought-provoking insights. Obviously, some good news, some bad news, but some unanswered questions as well. So we do have a bit of time for questions. And we are going to hear a little bit more during the program about utilising the climate risk assessment information. So that's coming up a little bit later. Any questions from the floor? Tim?
Dave, thanks for the presentation. Fantastic. I just want your thoughts on the comment you made about urban biodiversity in cities is greater than it was.
Yeah.
And perhaps challenge that in terms of the outer ring of suburbs where you have 400 square metres lots with 400 square metre houses on them. And those strips that are postage stamps. How do we get real biodiversity in those sorts of suburbs?
So this is going back to my PhD, I can talk about. So the most diverse gardens were the old terraces in the centre of Ballarat. So they're tiny little postage stamp front yards that just had amazing plant diversity. So I don't think that the lack of space is a limit to diversity. It's definitely a limit for trees. So that's a different kind of story. I think public landscape has to take more responsibility for trees, given the way that's gone, and that's happening in inner and middle suburbs too with densification. So I think that that diversity builds up over time. So as people change, so people move from house to house, people add things to their gardens, and that's one of the drivers of diversity. It's a question about knowledge and time too. So I think a lot of the people living in those more terraces were probably older people with more time who are keen gardeners, and the people who are living out in the burbs with big houses are mostly time poor. So I think that there'll be a change in that naturally over time, and all we can do is encourage that change. It's not something we can dramatically go in and change quickly. But gardening is the biggest pastime in Australia still. I think there's a little bit of a decline in that in Australia and the UK, but we should see this as a positive story and how we can get in yeah, I mean, there's obviously complex interactions with markets and the nursery industry, but there's still a big, plant exchange thing that goes on. People grow their own plants. The shift back to veggie gardening that's happening at the moment is kind of interesting too, because that really fosters seed saving and plant exchange. And there's kind of lots of ways we can get into that space while, acknowledging some of the limitations with the market and industry. So, I think there's such diversity in plants and such diversity in people that naturally, when you get different people working and giving people opportunities over time, it will lead to really increased diversity in those landscapes. So I'm always pretty optimistic, but I can see a pathway forward there.
Dave, you look specifically at the southeastern growth corridor at once, what we showed.
Yeah.
And the Crown and Gardens influence, was there any correlation?
So
Did everyone hear that question?
So the question was about cranberry and its influence, and I'm just trying to remember because this is a few years ago we did this work. So we did find that there was some connection between the gardens, and again, I think it was more a story about people looking for information and knowledge, and so they were looking to the gardens for this kind of information. Yeah. I'd have to go back and double check. That's okay.
Hi, Jeff, thanks for the presentation. I'm just wondering if there's any going to be a public resource available for some of the data that is accessible to Botanic and also the public.
Okay, so the climate stuff, we should talk to Peter about this. So there's certainly a project that's being led by the gardens here to make the climate data available to other gardens. So the other work this is all kind of hot off the press. So we will have some kind of public report, I guess. I'm not sure how public it'll be. I need to talk to. So it's being done in conjunction with the Botanic Gardens here. So Robin Pinty in marketing, but also the state government with DELP, Melbourne Water, and the City of Melbourne as well. So there's a lot of, I think, from my point of view, there's always intentions to get this stuff out so people can use it. There's obviously some really interesting learnings out of the focus groups, but there's other data we've put together and some tools that are hopefully going to help people navigate how to make interventions in the landscape that promote diversity and positive behaviours from people.
Thank you, your talk was very interesting. Did any of your research point to any small steps that Botanic Gardens can take to involve the local populace?
So this is kind of the next phase of that project, is taking this information and working out what we can do. So I think recognising the fact that people are diverse, there's not like a best answer, there's not one answer to that. So it really depends on the gardens and the local communities and the sections of the community that you want to work with. So I think that people are looking for all, the good story is that people are looking for all of these things. They're looking for stories about heritage, they're looking for stories about conservation, they're looking for stories about mental health, physical activity, and I think that the changes we've seen in the Botanic Gardens here in particular over the last sort of 10 or 15 years, there's a whole lot of things that we can do that bring people to the gardens for a variety of reasons that lead to different kinds of outcomes. So there's not a single and simple answer, but lots of opportunities.
Well, we've got time for one more, and there was one there. Yep.
Yes, Dave, I was interested in your comment. Over 65 seem to know more about nature than the younger people. And being literally at over 65, I remember in primary school, nature study was a very big part of the curriculum.
Yeah.
It was almost an 80 part.
Yeah.
And it seems to have been lost. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting story too. I think that the focus, the way that we're kind of optimising education, through things like NAPLAN, and there's a whole lot of stuff that's going on that works against, including nature and more complex kind of ideas and place-based ideas in curriculum. So I'm a lecturer in environmental management at university, so my experience is the students all love this stuff and it's great, but I think in general that's not the case. And there's big opportunities. Some of it will be about improving educational outcomes. There's more and more research that shows that direct contact with nature is good for learning experiences, and all of the different ways that nature can be used in telling the stories about the curriculum, lots of different parts of the curriculum too. So I think that, again, I'm always optimistic. I think that there's a shift back towards more understanding of nature and using nature in schools. So the kitchen gardens are a good example of that. So I hope we continue on that trajectory. So.
Great. Well, thank you again, Dave, for I think really beautifully setting up. For really beautifully setting up the rest of the program.